Today we'll be focusing on sensory versus motor pathways and how they differ. Then we'll talk about the details of motor pathways and how they're regulated. And lastly, we'll end up talking about how damage and disease can impact these pathways. First of all, let's review the somatosensory pathways. These are three neuron pathways. The first neurons in these pathways begin in the skin or internal locations, and these neurons are bundled together into spinal nerves that terminate in the spinal cord gray matter. The second order neurons travel up the spinal cord, then cross over at the medulla oblongata, and then pass up to the thalamus. The third order neurons begin in these gray matter nuclei of the thalamus and then transmit their signals through the white matter tracts out to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, as shown here. Now, it's easy to imagine how these pathways could be impacted by damage or disease, especially if we think about the individual locations. The first order neurons could be impacted because the spinal nerves are a little bit exposed, not being within the vertebrae themselves. These first order neurons could be impacted if you, say, fell on your back and some swelling started to impinge on those nerves. Also, if one of the intervertebral discs herniates, some of the gel could impinge on the nerve, preventing signals from passing through. The second order neurons passing their way up the spinal cord would be impacted by damage to the spinal cord itself, for example, from a bad fall, a car accident, or other injury. The third order neurons travel all the way to the cortex and thus are most susceptible to stroke damage. While sensory pathways are typically three neuron pathways that are relayed via the thalamus, motor pathways are notably different. These are two neuron pathways beginning in the primary motor cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, passing via the internal capsule, which is one of the projection fibers, and these single upper motor neurons pass all the way down the spinal cord where they terminate in the gray matter, where the lower motor neurons or second order neurons transmit the signals to the skeletal muscle. So again, these are two neuron pathways. They bypass the thalamus entirely. They do, like sensory pathways, though, cross over to the opposite side. So the right motor cortex controls left side musculature. Now, in terms of what can impact these pathways, it's very similar again. Any cortical damage out here from, say, stroke or a trauma would impact the upper motor neurons or the first order motor neurons. The second order motor neurons would be most notably damaged by inflammation or disc herniation. In addition, there are a couple notable diseases that impact these neurons. Motor neuron diseases such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, can actually kill these nerves over time, eventually causing death by respiratory or breathing failure. Turns out that actual motor activity requires quite a bit more complexity than just two neuron pathways. In addition to those pathways starting at the primary motor cortex, there are additional locations, including sensory pathways coming back, the cerebellum, the premotor cortex, and subcortical locations of the cerebrum that impact these motor pathways. In no particular order, the sensory systems are important because these provide important feedback to motor pathways. For example, there's a big difference between lifting a piece of paper and lifting a 25-pound free weight. Similarly, if you feel in your toes or in your inner ear that you're about to fall forward, you're going to need to have some feedback to plantar flex so you don't actually fall flat on your face. So there are both proprioceptive sensory pathways and cerebellar pathways that take in some of this information and regulate your motor activity so that you're coordinated. Similarly, there has to be timing of multiple muscle actions. For example, anytime you shoot a free throw, it's not a single muscular action, it's quite a few muscular actions that have to be timed in a particular order. When these pathways are damaged, we have improper motor activity, as shown in these GIFs in the next slide. These are gentlemen that have had damage to their cerebellums, and this leads to a condition called ataxia. The parts of motor systems that are most difficult to understand for most folks involve the basal ganglia. These are subcortical regions of the cerebrum that regulate motor systems. Now, if we look at this slide, we'll see regions of the basal ganglia, notably called the striatum and other locations. You do not have to know the names of these subcortical regions. But what we'll see is that there are feedback loops going from the primary motor cortex out here through the subcortex and back up to the motor cortex itself. Now, this is clearly confusing, and I'll try to simplify it as best I can. The basic idea is that motor neurons will, on occasion, fire randomly. And that's quite a bit different from an intentional motor signal where you really are trying to get a muscle to contract. So, if there's an inadvertent motor signal that passes from the motor cortex down to the basal ganglia subcortical regions, we want to tamp those down so we don't inadvertently get a muscular contraction. On the other hand, if it's an inadvertent or intentional signal that's signaled from the motor cortex, we want to amplify that signal and stimulate it so that we get a good, powerful motor activity. Now, the impacts of these systems being broken down by disease or damage are a number of disorders that you may have heard of. In particular, multiple sclerosis, which eliminates the myelin protective sheath on some of these neurons thanks to autoimmune activity, can lead to an inability to fire these circuits, causing a loss of motor activity over time. Inadvertent muscular activity can also be seen in disorders such as Parkinsonism, as seen in these GIFs at the bottom of the screen. So, to summarize, the pathways that regulate motor activity are those that take in sensory information, and these involve proprioceptive sensory information, touch, as well as the inner ear. These are processed in the cerebellum and other locations, and trauma or psychoactive substance use will impact these systems and lead to uncoordinated motor activity. In addition, the basal ganglia subcortical regions are involved in either inhibiting or stimulating these motor circuits, and damage to these pathways, either through a genetic disorder or genetic and environmental impacts, can lead to either inadvertent or unintentional motor activity, such as in a tic disorder or Huntington's disease, or can lead to an inability to use your muscular regions, or lead to an inability to control your muscular actions in terms of multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's.